Good evening, class. We're going to go ahead and begin our lecture. Lecture number 1. We're going to be covering the central nervous system, and particularly, we're going to be delving into the spinal cord. So, if you recall, before we went on break for the winter, we were also reviewing the nervous system. We talked about neurons, we talked about neuroglia, we talked about the brain, the different parts of the brain. And if you recall, all of those parts were part of the central nervous system. We said the brain and the spinal cord particularly are the structures that I'm referring to, part of the central nervous system. And then we're also going to find nerves that are going to be outside the central nervous system, which are those that we find perhaps in our arms, in our legs, in our gut. And we'll talk about those as we go on. But for right now, I just want everyone to kind of be on the same page here. We're talking about the central nervous system. We've talked about the brain last semester, and now we're moving on to the spinal cord. Okay, so that's the goal for the next part of the lecture, the spinal cord. So after we talk about the spinal cord, we'll move on to the spinal nerves. Okay. And you might ask yourself, well, what exactly is the spinal cord? Well, the spinal cord, again, it's part of the central nervous system. It works closely with the brain, and it also works closely with the nerves of the peripheral nervous system. One other important thing to talk about when we talk about the spinal cord is that although it works closely with the brain, um, it can also function on its own. And you might wonder what I'm referring to when I say that. We're referring to things like reflexes. And again, I'll talk about this in more detail later, but there are certain functions that we have control over, we have conscious mental control over, and there are other reactions that we call reflexes. Okay, specifically spinal reflexes is what we're talking about, and we'll go on and discuss that later. All right, so a little bit more here. Both the brain and the spinal cord are going to receive sensory input from receptors throughout the body. So the receptors that we might have in our hands, on the tips of our fingers that pick up on the environment, the brain and the spinal cord will receive those impulses. Okay. Also, the brain and the spinal cord both contain something called reflex centers. And lastly, um, they're both able to send motor output signals. Okay, and they're going to send those to the effectors. And remember, the effectors are just that term that we give to structures that react to those motor output functions. So when we talk about the spinal cord, if we kind of zoom in here and we discuss what's the important thing to know about the spinal cord, we'll talk about some basic information here. First of all, the adult spinal cord is going to fall within certain dimensions. It's about 45 centimeters long. And then this next little thing is something quite interesting, and something that'll be important to keep in mind. It's actually shorter than the vertebral column. So as you know, you have the vertebrae, as we talked about during last semester. We talked about those cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. Hopefully, you all remember the numbers of those. Okay, we said we're going to have those different regions of those vertebrae, and then there's also the sacrum and the coccyx. And the important thing to just understand here is that the actual spinal cord that's going to be protected mostly by those vertebrae is actually shorter than the vertebral column itself. And the next image that I show you will describe that and help you visualize that a little bit better. But just keep that in mind for right now, that it's actually the spinal cord itself doesn't go throughout the whole length of the vertebral column. All right, so again, 45 centimeters long, that equates to about 18 inches, not as long as the vertebral column. It's going to end in adults between about the L1 to L2 area. All right, and then as we go down this spinal cord, we're going to see that there are certain branches that segment off the spinal cord. Those structures are what we know as spinal nerves. Okay, so we're going to be studying these as well. We're going to study 31 different segments, which will branch out to become 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves that are going to emerge from the lateral aspects of the spinal cord. And they're going to emerge from the spinal cord via two important structures that you need to know. Okay, those two structures are going to be called either the dorsal root or the ventral root. And again, I'm going to show you a picture soon, but just keep in mind, there's a structure called the dorsal root, there's a structure called the ventral root, and those 31 pairs of spinal merge are going to basically branch off of those roots, of those structures. All right, so we said that the spinal cord can be divided into several different sections here. Very similar to how the vertebral column itself is divided into several sections, so too is the spinal cord. It's a little bit different here than the actual bones, but similar, all all the same. So let's go through this. So the first segment of the spinal cord includes 8 cervical spinal nerves. Okay, now that might sound a little bit off. If you study, if you still remembered, I'm sure you studied, but if you still remember from last semester, um, we there's actually 7 cervical vertebrae. Okay, so we actually have one more spinal nerve than we do cervical vertebrae. So we're gonna say that there are 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves. Okay, then we're gonna follow that with 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves. I'm sure you're already figuring this out. The cervical spinal nerves are going to be found in the cervical region of the spine. The 12 thoracic spinal nerves are going to be found in the thoracic area of the spine. Okay, following that, we have the lumbar spinal nerves. We're going to have 5 pairs of those. We're going to find 5 sacral, and then we're going to have 1 coccygeal. Okay, so again, we're going to divide the spinal cord into 31 separate segments, and if we were to break that down, we said 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccyx. Okay, that's where they all kind of branch out from at that level. So if we were to kind of rewrite this in a different way, make it a little bit different here, we can say that as far as the cervical spinal nerves are concerned, these are going to be so numbered as C1 through C8. Okay? C1 through C8. As far as the thoracic spinal nerves are concerned, okay, the 12 of those are going to be named T1, and you may have already guessed it, through T12. Okay. The lumbar, okay, those are going to range from L1 all the way to L5. Okay. And then, of course, as we mentioned, the sacral and the coccygeal segment, um, these are not going to actually have the spinal nerves coming out from them. And I'll show you what I mean in just a moment. All right, so once again, we're going to have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Okay, and these are going to come from the 31 spinal cord segments that we just talked about. And we said that these are going to be identified by the association with the adjacent vertebrae. Okay, we said that in the cervical region, ranging from the cervical vertebrae C1 through C7, we're actually going to have the spinal nerves C1 through C8. Because remember, we said we're going to have just one more extraaxial spinal nerve than we do have cervical vertebrae in this region. Okay, so C1 through C8, we're not talking about the vertebrae themselves. Remember, we're talking about the spinal nerves. And then for the thoracic region, we said we had T1 through T12. For the lumbar, we have L1 through L5. So again, as you can see, it's all basically the same in this region as we've discussed. The only big difference is that there's one more spinal nerve that's found in the cervical region than there is actual cervical vertebrae. Okay, so there's only 7 cervical vertebrae, but we have 8 cervical spinal nerves. Okay, or 8 pairs, we should say. And the reason for that is the first spinal nerve actually comes off of the top of the first cervical vertebrae. So it basically, we start counting it before we start actually counting the cervical vertebrae themselves. So we said we're going to have 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar. Okay, and then lastly, in the final region for the sacral and coccygeal, we're going to have 6 more. Okay, the 6 last ones are down there. Okay, and these are a little bit different. They're a little bit special, if you will, and I'll show you what I mean in just a bit. Let's move on here. Okay, so here's the next section here. This is showing us an image of what the spinal cord looks like, what the spinal nerves look like, and then what the vertebrae all look like. Okay, so again, you can see that this first section that's colored here in blue represents those 8 cervical spinal nerves. The next area outlined in orange represents the next 12 thoracic spinal nerves. Okay, and then we said that the next section here is going to represent the 5 lumbar spinal nerves. And then we have the sacrum and the coccyx, which represent those last 6 that we mentioned. Okay. Now, another thing to kind of take note of here is that you can see these different segments of the spinal cord that we talked about, where we divide into the respective segments, and then we get a spinal nerve that kind of branches out. So, for example, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 segments here, and you can see that there are 8 spinal nerves that branch out from those segments. Okay, so that's why we said we have C1 through C8, and the reason why we said there's one more spinal nerve in the cervical region than there are bones in the cervical region is because the first spinal nerve actually begins above the first cervical vertebrae. Now you'll notice that the thoracic vertebrae are going to be arranged in a very similar fashion, where more or less where we find that segment we're going to see that that spinal nerve exits from the foramen of the vertebrae itself. Okay, remember those vertebrae have a small foramen where the spinal nerves exit from. So you see that that's pretty much true most of the way through. Okay, so again, this is the cervical region, the thoracic region. Okay, you can see all the spinal nerves like jutting through. Okay, remember this is the lumbar region. Okay, and then this is the sacral and the coccyx region, right? And these were those six that we said were kind of a little bit weird. Okay, because as you can see here, the actual spinal cord itself ends at that level. Okay, it ends at this level. So all of the other spinal nerves that you see here, um, they kind of flow off the very, very end of the main portion of the spinal cord itself. It kind of looks like a ponytail, if you would, right? The little strands of the ponytail kind of um, growing or hanging off the end of what is actually the spinal cord. Okay, now all of this is going to be important because you're going to need to identify the different regions of the spinal cord, and we're going to give them some special names. Okay, so when we're looking at the spinal cord itself, where we drew the little line here, okay, that's going to have a special name. That's known as the conus medullaris. Okay, so that's the term here. Okay, that's known as the conus medullaris. This area here. So where the actual spinal cord ends. Okay, where the actual spinal cord ends. We call it the conus medullaris. And the area where it ends is at about the L1, L2 vertebrae. Okay, so you'll see that below the conus medullaris, we're going to find these long nerves, these long roots that project inferiorly. Okay. Now, these nerves, like I said, they're going to form a type of ponytail. They kind of look like a ponytail flowing from the very, very end, right? So the very, very end of the spinal cord, we said conus medullaris, and then we have these spinal nerves that project inferiorly, these roots that project inferiorly after the L1, L2 portion. We're going to call that the cauda equina. That literally means the horse's tail. Okay, so all of these nerves that we're talking about down here that project further than the conus medullaris, we said we're going to call that the cauda equina, okay, the horse's tail. And then we said that the actual level where the spinal cord ends is known as the conus medullaris. And we said that's going to be marked at about the L1, L2 level. Okay, so again, we said that the conus medullaris, okay, that term comes from the term medullary and cone. So this is a tapered cone-shaped part of the spinal cord inferior to the lumbar enlargement. The cauda equina, okay, cauda, it means tail, equinus is horse. We said that this is a collection of the dorsal and ventral roots of the spinal segments, L2 to S5, along with the phylum terminale. Now you might be wondering, okay, so what is the phylum terminale? Okay, well, the phylum terminale is going to be fibrous tissue. And this fibrous tissue basically is going to help bind or help connect the spinal cord to the coccyx. Okay, so that's what the phylum terminale is. It's basically connective tissue that tapes or glues the spinal cord to the coccyx. Okay, and then we have the phylum terminale, same thing here. Okay, we're just defining it here. This is the terminal thread. This is a slender strand of fibrous tissue extending from the inferior tip of the conus medullaris to the second sacral vertebrae. It's going to provide support to the spinal cord. Okay, now this is a great picture that goes through everything that we're talking about. So remember, back here, we're looking at the occipital bone. Okay, this is the brain. Remember, we have the foramen magnum, and then below the foramen magnum, we're going to have the spinal cord. And we just said that the spinal cord is going to be divided into several different sections. We have the cervical section, we have the thoracic section, we have the lumbar section, we have the sacral section, and we have the coccygeal section. We said that although there are 7 cervical vertebrae, we're actually going to have 8 spinal nerves, 8 cervical spinal nerves, I should say. And those are going to be so named or numbered as C1 all the way down to C8. Okay, now this cervical enlargement is just saying that in this cervical area of the spinal cord, there's a little bit of a belly, as you can see here. It kind of enlarges. Okay, now continuing down below the level of C8, we're going to continue into T1 through T12. And we said that that's going to represent the 12 thoracic spinal nerves. Okay, we can see that there's another enlargement here. We're going to call this one the lumbar enlargement because we're going to find that enlargement at the level of the lumbar spinal nerves. And that's where they begin here. As you can see, it's kind of an overlap. So we then have the lumbar spinal nerves here, and those are going to be so named as L1 all the way to L5. And we said at the level of about L1 to L2, the actual spinal cord itself is going to end, and we're going to call that the conus medullaris. Now, below the conus medullaris, we're going to have the rest of those spinal nerves that are going to kind of look like a ponytail. And we said that those we're going to call the quada equina. Okay, and we said that the spinal cord, the quada equina, is going to be attached to the sacrum and the coccyx down here by a band of connective tissue that we said we're going to call the filum terminale. Okay. Now, just a couple of other terms that we can discuss here. Something called the posterior median sulcus. Okay, this is going to be a shallow groove on the dorsal surface of the vertebrae. And we're also going to have another structure that's called the anterior median fissure. Okay, this is a deep groove on the ventral surface. And we talked about those terms a little bit last semester. If you recall, the anterior median fissure contained the folds for the pia mater. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about the spinal meninges. So if you recall, when we were talking about the brain, we said that the brain is going to be protected by a structure known as the meninges. We said that there are 3 meninges that are going to protect the brain. The spinal meninges are somewhat similar, really. Okay, so these spinal meninges are going to be a series of specialized membranes that are going to surround the spinal cord, and they're going to provide physical stability, shock absorption. They contain blood vessels that help deliver oxygen and nutrients to the cells of the spinal cord, and also help to remove waste products. Okay, so these meninges are continuous with the cranial meninges that we said that we find surrounding the brain, and just as they were named in the brain, the 3 different layers, we talked about the dura mater, which was that tough, fibrous outer layer, the arachnoid matter, which was that middle, kind of spongy, spider web-like layer, and then the pia mater, which was the innermost layer. All right, and we can kind of see the arrangement of the spinal cord here. So in order to understand what we're looking at here, So this structure here, I hope everybody understands. That's bone. Okay, that's the vertebrae. All of this that you see back here is bone of the vertebrae. These openings here are those foramina that the spinal nerves um, exited and entered um, the foramen here in the middle. Okay, these are those openings that we talked about. And then we actually have the spinal cord itself. Okay. Now, if we start from the outside, once again, we talked about this being the bone. And then as we move towards the inside, you can see that the nerves are going to be covered by a membrane along with um, the spinal cord itself. And we said that that outer layer of the meninges here was called the dura mater. Okay, we said that the spinal cord, the spinal nerves, they're going to be covered by these meningeal layers, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, the pia mater. Okay, we said that these different layers are going to protect against different things like shock. They're going to provide blood. They're going to remove wastes. And we said that the first one that we'll talk about from the outside going in was called the dura mater. Okay, now one thing to understand here is that the dura mater, um, it's not going to be fused to the actual bone itself. Okay, it's just going to be found on the outside of the spinal cord itself and covering the actual nerves. Um, the space that we're going to find in between the dura mater and the vertebrae itself, okay, we're going to call that the epidural space. Okay, and the epidural space is going to contain a couple of different structures. It's going to contain some areolar tissue, also known as connective tissue. It has adipose tissue for padding. The epidural space that it might sound familiar. There's a type of procedure known as an epidural block, an epi block, and that's basically what we're talking about here. An epidural block is when a needle is inserted into this epidural space that we're talking about in order for anesthetics to be injected into that space. And when an anesthetic is injected into that space that we're talking about, um, that medication would affect only the nearby spinal nerves. Okay, and basically it would numb that area. Okay, usually um, this is considered still a type of local anesthetic. Okay, now another procedure that's sometimes done is called a spinal tap, also known as a lumbar puncture. Now, this is performed by using a long needle, and this needle actually traverses through the dura mater, and it actually needs to enter into the arachnoid space. And the level where this procedure is typically done is just below the level of L2, where we said that the spinal cord ends essentially and then splits into the quada equina. All right, so that we said once again that outer layer was known as the dura mater. Okay, as you can see, the artist is kind of cutting or peeling away that dura mater, and the layer that we have next here would be the arachnoid mater. Okay, and again, if we were to peel further through the arachnoid mater, we would then have the pia mater, which would essentially be fused to the spinal cord itself. And that's what we're looking at here. This is the spinal cord. And you can see that the spinal cord is essentially going to be made up of two separate sections, as we talked about last semester. There's the inner portion, which is known as the gray matter. Hope you remember what part of the cells we mostly find within the gray matter. Okay, remember we said that it's going to be mostly the unmyelinated axons, but really we're talking about the soma. We're talking about the cell bodies of the neurons that are found mostly in the gray matter. Okay, and then surrounding the gray matter that we can see here, we have the white matter. And we said that the white matter is mainly going to be composed of myelinated axons. Okay, and then here we can see that jutting out from this structure, this X-like structure of gray matter, kind of branching out from either the two back ends or the two front ends, we have these nerves. Okay, and these are basically those roots that we talked about earlier. Okay, and we'll talk about these in more detail a little bit later. And then just so that you know, we're looking at the spinal cord from the back. Okay, so this is not like we're looking at it forward anteriorly, we're looking at it posteriorly. So for that reason, this back branch that we're talking about, this would be like the back. This would be the dorsal root. Okay. And then this front branch here, we would call it the ventral root. And you can see that the ventral and the dorsal root, they meet at a certain point, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about these actual spinal nerves. Okay, those are those 31 pairs that we've been talking about. So that would be another one and another one and another one. And then just please don't forget, they're covered by the meninges. And we talked about the epidural space. Okay, we talked about the arachnoid space, where typically a spinal tap is performed. The needle traverses all the way to this point. We talked about the dorsal root, we talked about the ventral root, and we talked about the spinal nerve. So hopefully all that is starting to make sense and it's coming together. All right, so again, when we talk about the different meninges, we said that we're going to find spaces in between the different meninges, right? We're going to find these potential spaces between the different layers. And one of those spaces that we'll talk about, these are two important spaces. One of those important spaces, we actually kind of already talked about this one. This was that subarachnoid space. So we said as soon as we traverse through the um the arachnoid meninge, the arachnoid meningeal layer, um the arachnoid matter, then we're now entering the subarachnoid space, right? Okay, so the subarachnoid space is the space that's going to attach the arachnoid matter to the pia mater below it. And this is where we find the cerebral spinal fluid. This is where we find the CSF. And again, I'm putting this in bold because it's important to understand what CSF is. We talked a lot about this last semester, but also it would be important to know that the location that we find the CSF would be the subarachnoid space. Okay, what does the CSF do? It acts as a shock absorber and also a type of medium for diffusion of gases, nutrients. Different chemical messengers are able to flow through the CSF, and also wastes are able to be cleaned up via the CSF. And then remember, another important term that we used was the epidural space. We said that the epidural space was between the dura mater and the walls of the actual vertebral canal, which would be like the actual wall of the bone itself, in between those two. And we said that that's where we're going to find areolar tissue. That's where we're going to find blood vessels. We're going to find adipose tissue within that space. Okay, we're not going to find CSF in the epidural space. Okay, here's another view of what we're talking about to help it make sense. So again, this would be posterior. This would be anterior. We're looking at the vertebral body. Okay, we're looking at the spine of a vertebrae. Okay, what you're looking at in blue here would be the most outer meninge, which would be the dura mater. And then, as we kind of view more inside, you can see here you have the arachnoid matter afterwards. And we said that after the arachnoid matter, all of this space here, this intimate space that we're talking about, that would be the subarachnoid space. Okay, all of this here. So once again, if we go from all the way out, this is the bone we've been talking about. Okay, all of this here would be the epidural space. Okay, we said that in the epidural space is where a person would receive the epidural injection, the spinal block that we talked about. You find adipose tissue, okay, here in the epidural space. And then this is the dura mater. Okay, epidura, right? Above the dura mater, epidural space. Okay, so this is the dura mater. And then right below the dura mater, we have the arachnoid mater, right? Below the arachnoid mater, we have the subarachnoid space, and that's where we find the CSF. And then deep to the subarachnoid space, we're going to have the PM mater. Okay, and then the PM mater, I'm sorry, the below the PM mater, we're going to have the actual spinal cord. And we said that the spinal cord can be divided into the gray matter on the inside and the white matter on the outside. Okay, we also said that there are two important roots that are going to branch off in through different sections of the spinal cord. And those that we find towards the front, we're going to call those the ventral roots. And those that we find towards the back, we're going to call those the dorsal roots. Okay, so we have this root of nerve fibers on the back that we call the dorsal root. They're going to communicate and continue here towards the inside, as you can see. Okay, this is the dorsal root. And then we're going to have this branch, which is called the ventral root. Okay, and we said that where the dorsal root and the ventral root kind of come together, we call that a spinal nerve. Okay, we call that a spinal nerve. So this is one of those pairs of spinal nerves that we're talking about. All right, hopefully that's making sense. All right, and then this is the spinal tap that we were talking about, right? So this would be basically the outside of the body going through one of those openings in between the vertebrae and passing through the epidural space in between the dura mater and the walls of the vertebral cavity itself. And we said that that's where the epidural needle would need to insert into in order to inject that medication, for example. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and move on here, and we'll take a look at a cross section of the spinal cord, and we're going to go ahead and identify different parts of the spinal cord. Okay, so before we look at the image, let's kind of talk about some important definitions here. Now, we've talked about these, but just to help solidify the concepts. So we said that when we're looking at a cross section of the spinal cord, we can divide the spinal cord into two different regions. There's a superficial layer that we're going to call the white matter. And we said that the white matter is associated with large numbers of myelinated axons mostly. You might find some unmyelinated axons as well, but the reason why it's white is because they're basically have myelin, right? These axons typically have myelin. But again, the important thing to keep in mind here is that the white matter is mostly going to be axons. Now, deep to the white matter, we said we're going to find the gray matter, and the gray matter is going to be dominated by cell bodies of those neurons that we were just speaking of. We might find some neuroglia, we might also find some unmyelinated axons, but mainly, as far as you guys are concerned, it's important to understand that the gray matter is mostly going to be the cell bodies or the soma of neurons. And this gray matter actually is going to surround a small foramen or a small opening in the very, very center of the spinal cord, known as the central canal. We're also going to have CSF running through that central canal. And this gray matter, the way that it's arranged, it's going to form a type of H or a type of butterfly shape to it. And you can really see that here. That's that H or butterfly-like shape that I'm referring to here. Okay, so again, we said that that central area, roughly shaped like an H or like the wings of a butterfly, is made up of a mass of gray matter. And we said that that's mostly made up of the cell bodies or the soma of neurons. We might find some unmyelinated neurons as well, but the important thing just to keep in mind for you all is that it's mainly going to be soma or cell bodies. And then the outer area here, we talked about that being called the white matter. We said that the white matter is going to surround the gray matter. It consists mostly of myelinated axons. Here in the center of the gray matter, we talked about the central canal, and we said that the central canal is going to contain CSF. Okay, and this central canal, little interesting fact here. This eventually closes off with age. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the arrangement of the spinal cord. So we're looking at the anterior cross section of the spinal cord. Um, so you can see that there's a fissure that we can see towards the front. This is going to be known as the anterior median fissure. Okay, we said that all of this tissue that the outside of the spinal cord is composed of, we said that that's known as the white matter. Okay, we said here in the center, that was the gray matter. Okay. We said that we had the central canal. Okay. Okay. Now, let's look at the gray matter in a little bit more detail. So you'll notice that on this image here, the gray matter is going to be divided into different colored sections, as you can see. What we're doing here is that we're dividing or organizing the gray matter based on its function. Okay, so this is the functional organization of the gray matter. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind is that even at the level of the spinal cord, we're not even talking about at the level of the brain, but at the level of the spinal cord, the gray matter, what its function is, it's to integrate sensory and motor information. Okay, so it's really in charge of integrating, of figuring out, I guess we can say in other words, what to do with either the sensory or motor information. I know it's important to think that and understand that the brain is the true master of this, but there are some certain lower level tasks that the spinal cord is in charge of. And again, specifically, the gray matter would be in charge of integrating that sensory and motor information. So you can see that dividing this gray matter functionally based on its primary role, we can divide this H-like shape of gray matter into two separate nuclei. Now, I hope you remember what the term nuclei means. Remember we talked about ganglion and we talked about nuclei? We said that a nuclei was a bunch of soma all wrapped together, right? We said that when we get like a cluster or a bunch of soma within the central nervous system, we call that a nuclei. Okay, and we can see that the gray matter is divided into two separate nuclei. Okay, the posterior part of the H, okay, the posterior part of this wing, if you will, is known as the sensory nuclei. Okay, and then this anterior portion is known as the motor nuclei. So that's something that you should dedicate to memory. Okay, so the front part is known as the motor nuclei. The back part is known as the sensory nuclei. Very important, okay? And you'll also notice here, if we're talking about the sensory nuclei, you'll notice that the arrow is pointing towards the gray matter. So that should give you the understanding that the sensory nuclei is going to receive sensory information from the body. Okay, it's going to receive sensory information from the peripheral nervous system. And again, the location where we find the sensory nuclei is going to be on the posterior horn of the gray matter, right? Because this kind of shaped like a horn. This is one of the posterior horns. This would be one of the anterior horns. Okay, so the sensory nuclei, which is going to receive sensory information from the peripheral nervous system, is located on the posterior horn, okay, or the posterior gray horn, the posterior dorsal horn. Okay, that's what this structure is called. Okay, and we said that it's going to receive input from, it's going to receive input from outside the spinal cord, we can say. Okay, it's going to receive input from the peripheral nervous system. Now, do you see this main root, this main nerve that, I mean, its main obligation is to deliver that sensory information that we're talking about to the dorsal horn? Well, that's called the dorsal root. Okay, so again, the sensory nuclei, which receives sensory information from the peripheral nervous system, which is located on the posterior or dorsal gray horn, is going to receive input from the dorsal root. Okay, and the dorsal root, okay, the dorsal root is known as the afferent pathway. Okay, and the reason why it's called the afferent pathway is, again, it's going to receive input, and that input moves away from the receptor. Okay, the efferent pathway, if we recall, it goes towards the effector. Okay, so I'm really hoping all these terms are making sense, because again, what we're doing is that we're building on the concepts that we learned last semester. If you didn't understand last semester, it's going to be tough, right? Because we're saying efferent, afferent, what does that mean? Again, if we were to break this down here, we'll say that the sensory nuclei, okay, which is located in the posterior gray horn or the dorsal horn, is going to receive input from the fibers that are located in the dorsal root. And essentially those fibers that we're talking about eventually are coming from the peripheral nervous system, right? They're sensory nerves that are found throughout the peripheral nervous system, and they're going to send that sensory information to this dorsal gray horn, right? And eventually, what we find here is the sensory nuclei, which is going to process some of that sensory information. Okay, it's gonna process some of that sensory info. Now you'll also see that this dorsal gray horn is divided into two areas. There's a somatic area and there's a visceral area. Okay, remember, somatic means body, visceral means organ. So what we're really talking about here is that this dorsal gray horn, this section here, the somatic area, would be responsible for processing and integrating sensory information that came basically from your body, while this portion would be responsible for processing and integrating sensory information that would come from your organs, like from your gut. All right, then you'll notice that towards the front here, we have another nuclei. Okay, now if this was the sensory nuclei here in the back of the dorsal gray horn, we can say that this nuclei in the front, which is known as the motor nuclei, would be located on the anterior gray horn. Okay, so the motor nuclei, okay, all of this area here, which is known as the motor nuclei, is located, as we said, on the anterior gray horn. Okay, and what this motor nuclei is going to do, it's going to receive that information, okay, from the sensory nuclei. Okay, once that sensory nuclei kind of integrated and process that information, it's gonna send that response, okay, to the motor nuclei, and that motor nuclei is then going to process its information and send a motor command to the peripheral nervous system. Okay, and again, you can see that the motor nuclei that's located on the anterior gray horn can also be divided into two separate sections. There's a visceral area, and then there's a somatic area. The somatic area would be responsible for sending those motor commands to the body, to the skeletal muscles, for example. And then the visceral area would be responsible for sending those motor commands to maybe different organs, right? Like, for example, your stomach. One other thing to talk about, one other term, the term commissures, okay, we can call them gray commissures. This is kind of what we're talking about here. You, I mean, the artist didn't really draw it in a way that makes it look different, but basically what a commissure is, it's where the axons cross between one portion of the spinal cord to the next. So again, if you were talking about this is the posterior gray horn and the anterior gray horn, you get a certain area of overcross within a commissure. All right, and then lastly, just how we had the dorsal root, which sends that sensory information to the posterior gray horn. Okay, and then we said that the motor output information gets sent via the anterior gray horn. Well, those fibers belonging to those neurons, they're going to be bound and wrapped into this main nerve, or this main bundle called the ventral root. Okay, so we have a dorsal root, you have a ventral root, okay, and they meet. Okay, and where they meet, we call those the spinal nerves. Okay, so the dorsal root is going to receive info, the ventral root is going to send info. So that's basically the job of the gray matter. What about the white matter? Okay, well, the white matter is going to carry information between different segments of the spinal cord, either to or from the brain. Okay, so some of this information, some of these soma, some of these neurons that are located in the sensory nuclei, for example, they're they're going to communicate not with the neurons that are located here in the motor nuclei, but they're going to send that information up to the brain using the tracts that are located in the white matter. Okay, so again, what white matter is, or what it does, is that it carries information between segments of the spinal cord and to and from the brain. Okay, now white matter is going to be arranged into columns that contain tracts, essentially, or they contain bundles of neurons. And these bundles of neurons are called tracts. So sometimes we'll have these bundles of neurons, sometimes we'll have these tracts that we're going to call ascending tracts. And as the name kind of describes it, these are going to be tracts that are going to send information ascendingly, right? Like upwards. Okay, they're going to carry sensory information to the brain. There are certain areas where we're going to have another type of tract, which is known as descending tracts. And these are a little bit different here. What the descending tracts do is that they're going to carry motor commands from the spinal cord and from the brain down into an effector. Okay, another important term here, the anterior white commissure. There's a posterior white commissure. And again, what those terms mean, they're very similar to the gray commissure, where we said that we have an overlap of neurons. Um, the same thing occurs with the white commissure, either the anterior or the posterior. It's just an overlap of an overlap or an interconnectiveness, I guess we can say. All right, so just to quickly review what we've talked about, the functional organization of gray matter, nuclei. Okay, we said that the term for a nuclei, the definition, it's a functional group of cell bodies. Okay, and we said that these are located within the central nervous system. So it's a group of cell bodies of these neurons that are located within the gray matter of the spinal cord. And they're often going to be grouped by region. We said that we have a sensory nuclei, which is going to receive and relay sensory information. And then there's a motor nuclei, which is going to issue those motor commands to peripheral effectors. Okay, the posterior gray horns, we said that this is the somatic sensory and, I'm sorry, the posterior gray horns are going to contain the somatic sensory and visceral nuclei. Okay, remember these are sensory nuclei. The anterior gray horns are going to contain the somatic motor nuclei. The gray commissure, we said that this consists of axons that cross from one side to the other. And then one other part that we didn't talk too much about was another term known as the lateral gray horns. These are kind of interesting. Now, if we go back to this image here, do you see how we talked about the motor nuclei and how the motor nuclei can be divided between a somatic and a visceral? And we said that the somatic would be responsible for processing and sending information or like motor commands to, for example, skeletal muscles. That's why it's called somatic. Well, the visceral portion of the motor nuclei, it would be responsible for sending those motor commands to your viscera, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Now, if we were to be really, really specific, do you see how there's like a little bump here? So we can actually call this the lateral gray horn. So the lateral gray horn is part of the anterior gray horn. It's like a little subsection of it, I guess we can say. Okay, the lateral gray horn. So the lateral gray horn, it's important to know that it's going to contain the motor nuclei for the viscera. Okay, the anterior gray horn is going to contain the motor nuclei for somatic. Okay, and then the posterior gray horn, it contains both the somatic and visceral sensory nuclei. Okay, so this is just showing us again what we were just talking about. This is a section of the spinal cord that's divided in half, where you can see this dotted line um, that runs across the central canal, and it's going to separate between a posterior and anterior half. Another way of seeing it is that it's dividing the spinal cord between a sensory portion, which is the posterior, and a motor portion, which is the anterior. Okay. also known as ventral. Okay, we said that this area here is known as the commissures, where we have the fibers that cross over essentially. Okay, we said that this is known as the gray matter of the spinal cord. This particular portion was known as the posterior gray horn. We said that the posterior gray horn is going to receive sensory information from the dorsal root. And we said that the posterior gray horn is going to contain the sensory nuclei, which is essentially divided between somatic and visceral. And then we said that the motor nuclei, which contains both the visceral and somatic areas, are going to send those motor commands via the ventral root. And we said where the sensory and the motor fibers meet, we have a spinal nerve. Okay, and then don't forget that the visceral motor nuclei can also be called the lateral gray horn. Okay, and then we said that the white matter can also be divided into different there's different structural organization of the white matter that we were referring to. It's divided into three columns on each side of the spinal cord. So there's going to be a posterior white column, there's a lateral white column, and then there's an anterior white column. So those are the three little columns of how the white matter is kind of arranged. And remember, those columns are responsible for sending either sensory information further up into the brain, or when the brain sends motor commands. So those motor commands are going to travel down these columns that we're talking about. Okay, when we're talking about the ascending or descending tracts. So these columns are going to contain tracts, which are bundles of axons. And all these axons in a tract are going to convey the same type of information in the same direction. And we said that we have either ascending or descending tracts. Okay. The anterior and posterior white commissure are going to interconnect these white columns. So again, if we're looking at just the white matter here, we said that there's a posterior column, right? Posterior area. Okay, there's a lateral area. Okay, and then there's the anterior area. Okay, these are just different tracts, as we said. Okay. And we said also, if we're looking at the posterior section of the spinal cord, this tract might be responsible for moving the leg. This tract might be responsible for sending the information to the hip, the trunk, so on and so forth. Or rather, okay, that's fine. Let's move on here. Okay, so spinal nerves, we already talked a little bit about this last semester, the basic organization of a nerve. Once again, remember there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. We said that these are so named based on their location and their relationship to adjacent vertebrae. We said that there are cervical, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal spinal nerves. These spinal nerves are going to innervate the body. Okay. And so this next image here, as you can see, it's showing us a cross section of what these spinal nerves look like. So again, we're not talking no longer about just the dorsal tract or the ventral tract. We're talking about the area where the two combine now. Okay, and as you can see, there are several different layers and several different structures that are going to make up what we understand as a spinal nerve. Kind of like how it was when we talked about muscles, right? The different organization of muscles and the strands. So when we talk about a spinal nerve, the outermost layer is going to be known as the epineurium. Okay, and then remember that what the epineurium is going to contain is a bunch of fascicles. Okay, that's what these structures are here. These are fascicles. Okay, and these fascicles themselves are going to be wrapped around another layer of connective tissue, which is known as the perineurium. And then in between these fascicles, we're going to find blood vessels. We're going to find connective tissue. Okay. And if we were to look inside one of these fascicles, we'll see that these fascicles are actually made up of nerves or actually axons of these nerves that are bundled together. Okay. And what's going to be found on the outside of one of each of these individual nerves is called the endoneurium, as you can see here. And if we were to go even further into the endoneurium, we would finally find the axon. And what you're looking at here on the outside, this is not actually the endoneurium. This is another layer. Okay, remember, these are the Schwann cells that are going to basically create that myelin to support the axon, essentially. Okay, so that's the connective tissue organization of a spinal nerve. Okay, again, important terms here. Okay, so spinal nerves, the nerves themselves are going to contain the axons of both sensory and motor neurons. And we said that the two main roots, the main root that we found on the back was known as the ventral root. It contains, I'm sorry, not the back, the front. The main nerve that we find on the front is known as the ventral nerve, and it's going to contain the axons for the motor neurons. The dorsal root was that main tract that we found on the back. It's going to contain the axons for the sensory neurons, whose cells bodies are found in the dorsal root ganglion, and we'll talk about that term a little bit later in more detail. But let's discuss this now. If you remember what a ganglion was a bunch of the cell bodies that are located outside the central nervous system. Okay. And those specific types of cells are going to be sensory neurons. Okay. So the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are located on the dorsal root ganglion. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later to help you all understand it. But just for right now, I just want to introduce you to these concepts. Each spinal cord segment has a pair of dorsal root ganglion, one on each side. All right. Okay, so let's kind of bring it all together. And we'll continue this and talk about this in more detail in another lecture that we'll have. But just to kind of get a basic understanding about the organization and how all of this works, um, I want everyone just to kind of remember a couple of different terms here, okay? So we're looking at the spinal cord here, right? And we said that the spinal cord can be divided into the white matter that we see on the outside and the gray matter that we have here on the inside. And we said that the gray matter is going to be shaped kind of like an H. And we said that we have a ventral horn and we have a dorsal horn. And we said that the ventral horn is going to be the horn that has the ability to send out information. And then the dorsal horn is going to be the one that receives the information. We're going to call this area the somatic, or rather, we should say the sensory nuclei. And then this would be the motor nuclei. And we said that the sensory nuclei, you can divide it between a somatic and a visceral section. So you can imagine, you have a nerve, and this nerve is a receptor nerve that's picking up on sensory information that's occurring in one of the organs on the inside of your body. So, like for example, you just ate something and you got like a stomach ache, okay, and it's sending that sensory information of that pain, okay, via those nerves, okay. So you can see that that information essentially is going to be sent, okay? Um, these tracts eventually reach the dorsal root, okay? where they then enter the sensory nuclei. Okay, so that's just an example there. Okay, now another thing that we might have here. We might have sensory information that's coming from the body or the limbs or whatever. Okay, so very similar. And this one down here, this was from visceral organs, and we'll talk about this later. This one's a little bit more complex, but these two are a little more straightforward. So you're getting information that's coming from your body. Okay, that's going to be sent via that dorsal root. Okay, now right before it enters the spinal cord, you can see that there's a ganglion. Okay, essentially that cluster of nerve cell bodies. Okay, and then they're going to send that sensory information into the somatic sensory nuclei or the visceral sensory nuclei, respectively. Okay. All right. And like I said, we'll discuss this in a little bit more detail in another lecture. We'll start the next one off kind of discussing this image here, but just kind of wanted to talk about that one with wrapping up. Okay. All right. So that ends this presentation. Like I mentioned, I'm going to record and send out another one, most likely maybe by Saturday or Sunday. We'll send out the second part. If you have any questions, feel free to send me out a message. Thanks for your attention and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.